Hi, this is going to be a short screencast on the bits of the axial skeleton that we didn't get to cover in lab. Just to review, all of this stuff here, whatever that gray, non-green color is, that's all axial skeleton. So skull, vertebral column, sacrum, coccyx, rib cage, and sternum. Starting out on the skull, you have your 4 paranasal sinuses. So you want to know which of your 4 skull bones contain sinuses: frontal, sphenoid, ethmoid, and maxilla, and then know the basic description and function of what a sinus is. And you'll note, right, these are lined by a mucosa or mucous membrane, just like your mouth and lungs. So when you get a head cold or a virus that's inflaming the mucous membranes in your nasal passages, it can get into the sinuses and inflame those mucous membranes, and that's where that sinus headache comes in. It gets worse whenever you have to bend over or pick something up, or that throbbing in your temples. That's most likely coming from the sphenoid sinus. So those are your sinuses. You want to know that the hyoid bone exists. It's right there in your throat. Important little fact, or interesting little fact about the hyoid bone is it's the only bone in the body that does not touch or articulate directly with another bone. It's just sort of suspended there by a bunch of muscles and ligaments for swallowing and speech. Then you have the vertebral column. So first you want to note there are 4 curvatures to the vertebral column: cervical, thoracic, lumbar, and sacral. Collectively, they provide, excuse me, I'm yawning, 2 mechanical or physical advantages to the vertebral column. One is strength and the other is flexibility. So let's assume for a second that your vertebral column only had one big curvature. It looked like that. And then you had a heavy weight that you were carrying on your shoulder, right? Your vertebral column would start to bow out further that way. That would put all the stress right there in the center, and this is where your back would likely give out. But because you have these 4 curvatures, really only 3 of them can flex. This one is fixed. But if you had, let's say, a weight on your shoulder, you're going to get a little bit of flexion here and some stress there, and a little bit more flexion here and some stress there. So you're spreading out the stress over more places, and you're effectively, if you're looking at this, right, it's almost like a lever and fulcrum, where you're applying force right here to the vertebral column in the middle, and these are your 2 levers. Over here, your levers are half of the vertebral column, and here it's only like a quarter. So there's a lot less force here and here if you have 2 curvatures as opposed to 1. Then they also offer, as it says here, some flexibility, right? So if your vertebral column were straight up and down, and I didn't quite draw it straight, right? You could compress it a little, but not nearly to the extent that the flexion allows your vertebral column to compress and move up and down. And what that does for you is take a lot of the shock away from your skull. So when you're moving or running or jumping, whatever it is you're doing, a lot of the shock waves or movement that would come up through your hips into your vertebral column and cause your skull to move around allows you to keep your skull a little bit more stable, which protects your brain from being jostled around, but also improves your vision, so that as you're running and moving, your head's not bouncing around so much, so you're going to have better vision. If you ever want a really good example of that, just go to YouTube and search for cheetah running, and you watch the cheetah's vertebral column is like a spring moving back and forth and up and down. It's undulating all over the place. The cheetah's head steady right above the ground, moving in a straight line, which gives it better vision for chasing down and killing delicious things. I'll stop there with the killing. But When I watch the nature movies, I root for the predators because it's fun. I don't know what that says about me. Moving right along, then we have down here 3 abnormal curvatures of the vertebral column. You just want to be able to match the curvature to the description. So, right, your vertebral column is supposed to go straight up and down when you look at it from the back. If it deviates to the left or the right, any lateral bending, that is scoliosis. You are supposed to have a curvature in your thoracic spine, but if it is exaggerated, then that's called kyphosis. And then if your lumbar curvature is exaggerated, that's called lordosis. As I understand it, kyphosis is much more common than lordosis. Here, I'm assuming that this woman is being forced into lordosis simply because of how the baby is being carried and how that extra weight is affecting her low back. Next up, the intervertebral discs, which we identified in lab, but we didn't really talk about. We did mention that they contain one of the connective tissues earlier. But first, let's just look at the disc. It's actually got 2 layers to it. There's an outer, very fibrous layer called the annulus fibrosus, and then an inner layer that's more like a very tough gel called the nucleus pulposus. So that's just elastic and compressible. The annulus fibrosus is a little bit tougher and basically keeps the nucleus pulposus from oozing out from in between any 2 vertebrae. This, you may recall, is composed of, does anybody remember? I had trouble remembering it. I'm not going to be able to fit that in there. Fibrocartilage with an E. There we go. So your fibrocartilaginous fibrocartilaginous annulus fibrosus. Then this is just an example of a herniated disc. This is one problem that could lead to low back pain. Pretty much all of us at some point in time are going to get compression or wearing out of our intervertebral discs. So you're going to see, if you get an x-ray, decreased space in between your 2 vertebrae. They just wear out, mostly because there aren't that many animals that walk upright as much the way humans do. And being that we are the first full-time upright animal that doesn't have a counterbalancing tail like an upright dinosaur or kangaroo might have, it puts a lot of pressure on our low back. Sometimes that just causes compression, which may or may not cause pain. Sometimes, if you're not properly supporting your back and leaning too far forward, it causes the nucleus pulposus to squirt out the back and put pressure on a spinal nerve. So that is one low back issue that could cause back pain. Also, a lot of people, if you just don't contract your abdominal muscles enough to help stabilize your core from twisting and other movements, you end up recruiting your back muscles, and your back muscles get overused, and you can get what feels like pinched nerve low back pain that's just coming from muscle strain. So if you do have low back pain, you do need to get it checked out and make sure whether you need to address abdominal and back and hamstring muscle imbalances, or if you really have a herniated disc, because the treatment for the 2 is quite different. And then there's osteoporosis, which this picture does not do justice to. So this, as this says, is a gradual loss of bone density. What it doesn't say here, and I don't know why I didn't get it into these PowerPoints, is that it tends to affect spongy bone more than, what's the word I'm looking for? Compact bone. So it targets spongy bone. So here you've got two different vertebrae, a young vertebral column, what's supposed to be an arrow, and an old vertebral column. The body of your vertebrae have lots of spongy bone in them, so they are susceptible to osteoporosis. This is why people appear to kind of shrink as they get older, because they do a little bit. They get compression fractures in their vertebrae. They end up with a little bit of kyphosis, maybe some lordosis, as the vertebrae start to break down and compress more. And then also, if you hear about older people falling and breaking their hip, the head of the femur has a lot of spongy bone in it and undergoes a lot of stress, so that will sometimes snap off in people that have osteoporosis. So if you ever hear somebody say, oh, they fell down and broke their hip, it's usually the opposite. They broke their hip and then they fell down because their hip broke. So that's all you need to know for that chapter, relatively short, under 12 minutes. Next up is going to be joints.